The courthouse in downtown Dallas loomed in the late afternoon sun, its limestone facade casting long, rigid shadows across the empty plaza. Inside, the echo of polished shoes against marble floors carried rhythm of power and permanence. Judge Robert Langley adjusted his black robe as he stepped into the courtroom, the familiar weight of authority pressing on his shoulders. To the public, he was a figure of integrity, stern, meticulous, untouchable. But behind the neatly combed hair and polished shoes, a restlessness simmered, a quiet longing he couldn't name. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and old paper, a scent Robert had long associated with justice and responsibility. He sank into the carved oak chair behind the bench, scanning the empty seats with a practiced eye. No one watched him now, but soon the doors would open and a sea of faces, attorneys, witnesses, jurors would fill the room. He had built a life on rules, precedents, and a carefully curated image. Yet tonight, a pulse of something forbidden thrummed beneath the surface. His phone vibrated quietly against the polished surface of the bench. A text message from an unknown number blinked on the screen. "I'll see you tonight. Don't tell anyone." He stared at the words, his pulse quickening despite himself. Robert's mind raced through possibilities, each more dangerous than the last. The courthouse, usually a sanctuary of order, suddenly felt like a cage, confining him in a life he no longer fully controlled. The sound of his secretary's heels clicking down the hall drew him back to reality. Margaret had been with him for over a decade, her loyalty unquestioned. "All set for the 4:30 docket, Your Honor," she said, her tone polite but laced with an unspoken question. Robert nodded, forcing calm into his expression. Margaret left with a small nod, leaving the courtroom silent again, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only companion to his thoughts. He allowed himself a moment to reflect. A lifetime spent in pursuit of order, fairness, and the perception of respectability. And yet, here he was, heart thudding at the prospect of breaking every rule he had sworn to uphold. There was a thrill in the danger, a magnetic pull towards something illicit and intoxicating. He didn't yet know the person behind the text, only that they had already begun to unravel the carefully constructed boundaries of his life. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting the courtroom in a shifting palette of amber and shadow. Robert stood, straightening his robe, and took a slow, deliberate walk along the bench, tracing his fingers along the carved edge. Outside, the city of Dallas moved obliviously, unaware of the quiet storm about to erupt within these chambers. Somewhere in the shadows, a presence waited, an intrusion into his rigid world, promising desire, temptation, and eventual catastrophe. As he left the courtroom, locking the doors behind him, Robert felt the first ripple of fear beneath his excitement. He knew, even now, that nothing would ever be the same. That quiet chamber, with its solemn walls and orderly benches, had witnessed decades of justice. But tonight, it had become the birthplace of secrets and the threshold to a world that could destroy him. The first text of many awaited him, and with it, the inevitability of a story that would spiral beyond control. The late evening air hung heavy over downtown Dallas, thick with a faint scent of exhaust and damp pavement. The courthouse was empty now, silent except for the occasional hum of a street lamp flickering outside. Robert Langley walked briskly toward the elevator, his mind still replaying the mysterious text that unsettled him hours ago. He told himself it was nothing, an uninvited thrill, but the words lingered, stubborn and insistent. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and a figure stepped inside just as he did. She was leaning against the polished metal wall, her dark hair pulled loosely back, eyes sharp and observant. Robert barely registered her presence at first, accustomed as he was to anonymity in his professional world. But there was something in her gaze, a mixture of confidence and hidden intent, that made him pause. "Evening, Judge Langley," she said, her voice smooth, measured. A faint smile curved her lips. There was an edge to it, almost playful, as if she had been expecting him. Robert swallowed, momentarily disarmed. "Good evening," he replied, voice careful, formal. He noted her ID badge, Elena Marks, legal assistant. She was new, or at least, he hadn't noticed her before. Her presence was deliberate, precise, a study in controlled charm. They rode the elevator in near silence, the occasional creak of machinery amplifying the tension. Robert found himself scrutinizing her, something he rarely did with colleagues. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes scanned him, appraising. She was someone used to reading people, a subtle predator in human form, and Robert felt an uncharacteristic flicker of curiosity and unease. "Quite late," she said after a moment, breaking the silence. "Most people leave the courthouse by now." Her gaze lingered just long enough to make him aware of his own solitude. "Yes," he admitted, feeling the words weigh heavier than they should. "Some work never truly ends, I suppose." Her smile deepened, enigmatic. "Perhaps it doesn't. But some things," she paused, glancing at the floor with a careful casualness, "are better kept private." Robert's pulse quickened. There was a hint of something forbidden in her words, a subtle challenge wrapped in civility. He wanted to dismiss it, to retreat behind the shield of professionalism. But the spark of intrigue had already taken root. The elevator dinged, and she stepped out on the same floor, moving with quiet grace through the dimly lit corridor. He followed, almost instinctively, as though drawn by an invisible tether. The shadows of the courthouse stretched long, twisting along the walls like dark fingers. He felt the first stirrings of danger, wrapped tightly with desire, a combination that both terrified and thrilled him. She stopped at a small office door, glancing back over her shoulder. "You'll find that some things in this building are not as straightforward as they seem," she said, voice soft, almost a whisper. Then she entered the office, leaving Robert in the muted glow of the corridor. He lingered, mind racing. Who was she, really? Why this aura of secrecy? And why did her presence make him feel like a man teetering on the edge of a precipice he had spent a lifetime avoiding? As he finally turned to leave, Robert felt the weight of possibility pressing on him. The courthouse, once a sanctuary of order, now seemed alive with hidden currents. Somewhere in the shadows, Elena's influence had begun to stir. And Robert knew, even if he could not yet articulate it, that nothing in his carefully controlled life would ever be the same. The first threads of their connection had been woven in the quiet darkness, and soon those threads would pull them both into a web of secrecy, desire, and inevitable danger. The courthouse hallway was quiet, almost eerily so, the dim glow of fluorescent lights casting long shadows across polished floors. Robert Langley's footsteps echoed faintly as he moved toward the exit, but he wasn't alone. Elena Marks appeared from around a corner, her presence deliberate, almost magnetic. She didn't speak immediately. She only watched him, her dark eyes shimmering with something unspoken. "Robert," she said finally, her voice low, careful. It was intimate, though they were still surrounded by empty offices and echoing hallways. "Do you ever wonder why some people feel invisible until the wrong moment finds them?" He stopped, startled by the depth of the question. Her gaze held him, unflinching. I don't follow," he admitted, though part of him understood far more than he should. Elena stepped closer, the faint scent of her perfume curling around him like smoke. "Some truths," she whispered, "only emerge when you're willing to risk everything. Don't you think?" Robert's pulse quickened. He should have felt anger or irritation at her cryptic tone, but instead there was a thrill, a pull he could not resist. "Risk everything? What are you talking about?" Her lips curved in a fleeting smile, one that suggested secrets she wasn't ready to share. "People hide behind masks, Robert. Even judges. Even those who enforce the law. And sometimes they meet someone who sees behind the mask." He swallowed hard, his mind spinning. She had always been astute, but this was different. Her words were no longer playful or teasing. They were direct, cutting to the careful layers of control he had built over decades. I shouldn't," he started, then faltered. He knew exactly what he was saying, that he was aware of the danger, that he felt the pull, and that he feared the consequences. Elena reached out, placing a hand lightly on his arm. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried weight, intimacy, and an unspoken promise. "You don't have to be afraid," she said. "Not with me. Not tonight." The hallway seemed to contract around them, the empty walls pressing closer. Robert's mind fought a battle between duty and desire, reason and instinct. He could imagine the headlines, the scandal, the ruin, but there was a voice inside him that no longer listened to warnings. The warmth of her hand, the intensity in her gaze, the subtle power she held. It all demanded surrender. I've never felt like this before, he confessed, voice barely above a whisper. I feel like I'm losing control. Her eyes softened, a rare vulnerability flickering across her features. Good, she said simply, because control is an illusion, and sometimes letting go is the only way to truly live. For a moment, they stood in silence, the air thick with unspoken truths. Their confessions weren't just about attraction. They were about loneliness, fear, longing, and a quiet desperation that had brought them together in the shadows of a world that demanded perfection. Then, without another word, Elena stepped back, breaking the spell. "We should go," she said, her tone calm but insistent, "before anyone notices us here." Robert nodded, tried to steady his racing heart. As they walked toward the exit, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting their long shadows along the hallway. He knew that the connection they had shared in those few moments would not remain confined to whispers and stolen glances. Something had shifted irreversibly, and neither of them could deny the pull that now bound them. As the courthouse doors closed behind them, the city of Dallas lay silent and sprawling beyond the glass. Night had begun to settle, and with it came the sense of possibilities, some thrilling, some dangerous, and some that would ultimately lead to consequences neither of them could yet foresee. The first true confession had been made, and the delicate threads of trust, secrecy, and desire were now woven together. Threads that would tighten, unravel, and eventually entangle them both in a web that stretched far beyond the quiet hallway. The next morning, Dallas moved with its usual rhythm, indifferent to the secrets hiding in the quiet corners of the courthouse. The hum of traffic, the chatter of early commuters, and the clang of construction all blended into a background noise that made the city feel alive, relentless, and unforgiving. Yet, somewhere beneath that pulse, whispers began to circulate, tiny hints that would grow into storms. Inside the courthouse, Robert Langley navigated the marble hallways with practiced efficiency. The echoes of his own footsteps now seemed heavier, burdened with the weight of what had passed the night before. He avoided the gaze of colleagues, even those he trusted, feeling a subtle paranoia creep into his chest. The courthouse had always been a stage, a place where order reigned. Now it felt fragile, like a glass sculpture threatened by the faintest tremor. Elena's presence lingered in his mind, more potent than the morning coffee he poured for himself. He told himself it was harmless, just a fleeting infatuation, but the way her words had clung to him, the way her gaze had cut through his defenses, it was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, in a quiet office on the second floor, Clara Simmons, a junior lawyer, sipped her tea and noticed a peculiar pattern. A few small anomalies in case files, whispers from colleagues, and the subtle tension in Robert's demeanor suggested something beyond the ordinary. She didn't know exactly what was yet, but instinct told her that hidden layers were unraveling. "People always have secrets," she muttered to herself, tapping her pen against the desk. "And the higher you rise, the darker they can be." Across the city, journalists stirred awake, their fingers poised over keyboards, waiting for any hint of scandal. The courthouse was fertile ground for speculation, and rumors had a way of growing legs in Dallas. By lunchtime, the first murmurs of impropriety, nothing concrete, just insinuations, had begun to circulate. Robert, oblivious, continued his docket, but the undercurrent of tension seemed almost tangible, pressing against the walls and doors, whispering of exposure. He passed a colleague, Thomas Weaver, a seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for observation and scrutiny. Weaver greeted him with a faint nod, eyes sharper than polite, lingering just a fraction too long. Robert felt the weight of that gaze and quickly diverted his path. Something was shifting, subtle but unmistakable. The courthouse was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage with invisible eyes, all waiting to catch the first misstep. Elena, meanwhile, worked quietly in her office, but her mind was far from the mundane tasks of filing and correspondence. She had a careful awareness of Robert's world, the routines, the vulnerabilities, and the small cracks where influence could take hold. The thrill of control, of being unseen yet powerful, pulsed through her veins. She understood the city, its gossip, and the way subtle observations could escalate into dangerous truths. By the end of the day, whispers had begun to solidify. A receptionist mentioned a strange late-night visit. A junior clerk recalled seeing Elena leaving the building with Robert under circumstances that made no sense on paper. Each murmur, each quiet observation was a spark. Individually, they seemed harmless. Together, they were the beginnings of a wildfire, ready to consume lives with relentless efficiency. As Robert left the courthouse that evening, the fading light of the sun cast long shadows across the streets. He felt eyes on him, though he couldn't identify them. Something was stirring in the city, a network of observation, gossip, and quiet suspicion that moved faster than any judge could control. And he knew, deep in the pit of his stomach, that his carefully hidden world was already beginning to crack. In the distance, the city's lights flickered on, one by one, illuminating streets that carried whispers, secrets, and the promise of exposure. The first tremors of scandal had begun, and neither he nor Elena could foresee how quickly those tremors would grow into an unstoppable force. The city lights of Dallas glimmered like distant stars through the slatted blinds of Elena Marks' small apartment. Inside, the room was a careful balance of minimalism and chaos. Stacked law books, half-empty coffee mugs, and files scattered across the desk. Yet beneath the surface of this modest space was a mind that thrived in shadows, one that had learned early how to navigate the cracks of the world. Tonight, she sat at her desk, reviewing her notes with meticulous precision that hinted at both ambition and obsession. Elena's thoughts drifted back, as they often did, to the patterns of her life. Childhood secrets, fractured relationships, and moments when trust had been weaponized against her. She had learned to be guarded, to manipulate perception with subtlety, and to extract power from information that others overlooked. Each misstep, each betrayal, had shaped her into someone who understood control, influence, and the fragility of appearances. Across the city, Robert Langley sat in his study at home, the courthouse lawn behind him, but the weight of its corridors lingering in his mind. The events of the past days, the stolen glances, the whispered confessions, the subtle manipulations, had begun to infiltrate his thoughts. He found himself questioning every interaction, every choice he had made. He had spent a lifetime enforcing rules. Yet here he was, teetering on the edge of a moral precipice, drawn into a hidden world that promised exhilaration at the cost of stability. The phone buzzed quietly on his desk. A text from Elena. "Do you ever wonder if we're just actors, playing parts for a city that watches too closely?" Robert's fingers hovered over the screen. He wanted to ignore it, to maintain the illusion of control, but curiosity, and something darker, pushed him to respond. "Sometimes, but actors can be caught." Elena replied almost instantly. "Then let's learn the stage together." Carefully, the thrill of secrecy, the adrenaline of danger, coursed through Robert's veins. He knew this was wrong, that the consequences could be catastrophic, yet he felt unable or unwilling to resist. Elena's influence was subtle, insidious, like a tide pulling him deeper into uncharted waters. Her past, however, was a hidden world of its own. Flashbacks of her early 20s revealed relationships marked by manipulation and betrayal, experiences that had taught her to anticipate human weakness. She had been used, deceived, and underestimated, and each wound had honed her instincts for survival and control. It was no coincidence that Robert, a man accustomed to authority and discipline, was drawn to her. She understood power in its unspoken forms, and she wielded it with careful precision. Robert, sitting in his leather chair, felt the first pangs of moral conflict. He saw himself reflected in Elena's words and gestures, a man capable of judgment, now judging his own desires. The boundaries between right and wrong blurred. His professional life, built on the illusion of order, now felt fragile, teetering on the edge of exposure. Meanwhile, Elena leaned back in her chair, eyes scanning the city skyline through the window. She understood that secrecy was a double-edged sword. The thrill of influence was intoxicating, but each calculated step carried the risk of exposure. Every text, every clandestine meeting, every confession shared in whispered corridors. These were threads of a web that could ensnare them both. And yet, both were compelled forward. Desire, curiosity, and unspoken need to explore forbidden territory bound them together, despite the potential cost. The hidden world they had begun to inhabit was seductive, dangerous, and intoxicating. By the end of the night, Robert and Elena had each retreated to their private spaces, yet neither could escape the gravitational pull of the other. The boundaries between their professional lives and secret desires were dissolving, creating a tension that simmered just beneath the surface. The city itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if Dallas had become an accomplice to their unfolding story. Tomorrow, the courthouse would resume its rigid order, yet the foundations had already shifted. The hidden world, once private and contained, was beginning to reveal cracks, and the first signs of disruption, subtle, almost imperceptible, were starting to emerge. What had begun as fascination and secrecy was evolving into something far more consuming. And somewhere in the shadows, the threads of influence, desire, and danger were weaving together, ready to pull them into a reality neither could fully control. The courthouse hummed with activity that morning, a familiar symphony of footsteps, hushed conversations, and the occasional metallic clang of briefcases. But for Robert Langley, the rhythm fell off, as if the building itself had shifted subtly, sensing the tremors beneath his carefully maintained life. Every glance from colleagues, every whisper exchange in the hallway, seemed loaded with implication, though he knew none of it was real, or at least, not yet. The first crack appeared innocuously enough. Clara Simmons, the junior lawyer who had long observed the courthouse like a hawk, lingered near the records room. She had noticed small anomalies, files slightly out of place, late arrivals, and glimpses of Robert moving through the building in ways that didn't align with his usual schedule. Individually, these could be dismissed, but collectively, a pattern began to emerge, a subtle signal that something unusual was unfolding. Robert passed her office on his way to chambers, his attention divided between his docket and the lingering thrill of Elena's presence. He felt eyes on him, and though he attempted to shrug it off, a subtle unease settled into his chest. There were moments when the thrill of secrecy was intoxicating, but it carried a cost. He could feel it now, the first threads of consequence tugging gently at the edges of his carefully controlled existence. Meanwhile, Elena moved through her day with the same composed precision she always displayed. Yet beneath her calm exterior, she felt a tremor of risk. Every message, every secret meeting, was a gamble. She was acutely aware of the courthouse's ecosystem, the colleagues, the clerks, the constant gaze of those who perceive and observe, and she knew that the smallest misstep could expose them both. It happened mid-morning, almost imperceptibly. A whispered comment, a glance exchanged between clerks, and Robert caught the tiniest flicker of recognition, suspicion. His heart skipped a beat. He could almost hear the courthouse itself breathing, sensing the delicate balance of order and chaos. Judge Langley, a colleague, called out casually, though there was an edge to the tone that made him pause. "You're scheduled for Chambers review at 11. Don't want you late." Robert nodded, masking the flutter of unease in his chest. He had arrived early, aware that every moment he spent in this building now carried weight beyond the ordinary. The possibility of exposure, once distant, now felt alarmingly tangible. Elena, sensing the shift even from her office, sent a brief text, careful. "Eyes are sharper than they appear." Robert read it discreetly. The familiar thrill mingled with the unmistakable sting of fear. The game they had been playing, once controlled and seductive, was beginning to crack. By afternoon, the fracture widened. A junior clerk noticed Elena leaving the building with Robert for an unscheduled meeting. A simple coincidence that could be explained, but only if one believed it. Gossip, as it often does, began to trickle quietly through the courthouse's labyrinthine corridors. Robert felt the first true sting of panic. Not at the idea of scandal, but at the realization that secrecy was no longer absolute. Every glance, every whisper, was a potential exposure. The invisible walls he had relied upon to keep his life compartmentalized were showing the first subtle fissures. Elena's voice, calm but firm, lingered in his mind. Control is an illusion. He had scoffed at it at first, but now he understood the depth of her warning. The first fracture had appeared, and the stakes had risen beyond personal indulgence. By the day's end, Robert walked through the courthouse corridors with newfound awareness. The whispers had not yet reached ears that mattered publicly, but the pulse of suspicion was real, insistent, and growing. Their hidden world, once a private indulgence, was beginning to feel like fragile glass under pressure, beautiful and dangerous, and poised to shatter. And as he left the building, the Texas sun dipping toward the horizon, he knew the delicate balance of secrecy had already begun to crumble. The first fracture was small, almost imperceptible, but it would not remain so for long. The morning sun had barely breached the Dallas skyline when the first alert flashed on Robert Langley's phone. Notifications from news outlets, blogs, and social media accounts surged in an unrelenting tide. His carefully constructed world, meticulously maintained for decades, was collapsing in real time. The headlines, stark and unflinching, appeared on every screen. Dallas judge's secret affair. Court scandal rock city. Accompanying it were photographs. Blurry snapshots of him leaving the courthouse late at night, hand brushing against a figure unmistakably identified as Elena Marks. His stomach twisted as he scrolled, the reality hitting with a force he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. In her apartment, Elena sat in silence, staring at the same headlines. She had always known the risk, understood the fragility of their hidden world, but seeing it spelled out publicly felt different. Her pulse raced, but there was a strange clarity in the chaos. Decisions had to be made, and timing would determine survival. Robert's office phone rang incessantly. Calls from colleagues, assistants, even family members blurred into a deafening cacophony of concern, accusation, and curiosity. He could barely form words, his voice catching on each syllable as he answered. I'm aware. I'll address it soon. But the reassurance fell hollow. The city's gaze had penetrated the veil he had relied upon for so long. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, a small crowd had begun to gather. Journalists flashed cameras and shouted questions, their microphones thrust toward empty air, as if hoping Robert might appear and provide a statement. Rumors, once subtle, had now taken flesh in the public eye. Every whispered speculation from the previous weeks had coalesced into undeniable scrutiny. Elena, aware of the growing storm, made her move. She left her apartment quietly, moving through dimly lit streets with precision that suggested experience and planning. No goodbye, no hint. Only a cryptic note left on Robert's desk. Some truths are better found alone. The note, brief and deliberate, left Robert staring at the polished wood for long moments. Panic surged, not solely from the exposure, but from the sudden disappearance of the one person who had both enticed and destabilized him. She was gone, and with her absence came an unsettling emptiness, a psychological weight he hadn't anticipated. By midday, the courthouse was a storm of hushed conversations and pointed glances. Robert tried to maintain composure, but his colleagues could see the strain etched into his face. Thomas Weaver, the seasoned prosecutor, approached him quietly, voice low but sharp. "Robert, people are talking. Be careful. This isn't just office gossip anymore." Robert nodded, masking the internal chaos with a veneer of professionalism. He walked the hallways with deliberate steps, aware that every move was under scrutiny. Each whisper, each sideways glance, reminded him that the world he had controlled for decades had shifted irrevocably. Even as he faced the public storm, Robert's mind kept returning to Elena, her absence, her intent, her mastery of the game they had played together. Was her disappearance voluntary, a calculated retreat, or was there something darker at work? The uncertainty gnawed at him, leaving him both desperate and helpless. By evening, news anchors dissected the scandal with the cold precision of professionals. Headlines had multiplied. High-profile Dallas judge entangled in affair. What we know so far, the vanishing of Elena Marks raises questions about Dallas courthouse secrets. Social media buzzed with speculation, opinion, and judgment. The city itself seemed complicit, alive with the reverberations of exposure. Robert retreated to his study, alone, the weight of the day pressing down like a physical force. The house, usually a sanctuary, fell hollow. The phone lay silent, but the echoes of the city's gaze lingered. The affair, once a thrilling clandestine connection, had transformed into a public spectacle, and with it, the delicate psychological web they had woven together had been shredded. In the shadows, Elena moved with purpose. She had vanished from the life Robert had known, but her influence lingered like a phantom. Every whisper, every flash of a camera, every judgmental glance in the courthouse corridors was a reminder of the power she had wielded and the danger she had sown. The night fell over Dallas, thick and heavy, and Robert sat by the window, staring at the illuminated skyline. The city had seen his secrets, and the cost of exposure was now unmistakable. Elena was gone, and with her absence came both relief and terror, a mixture that promised the next stage of chaos, confrontation, and emotional reckoning. The stage was set for consequences, both public and private. The affair had been exposed, the lover vanished, and the path forward would demand choices Robert had never imagined making. The city of Dallas, bathed in the pale glow of streetlights, seemed oblivious of the storm that had erupted in the life of Judge Robert Langley. But for him, the world had narrowed into a tight, suffocating focus. Elena Marks was gone. The courthouse corridors no longer echoed with whispered threats of exposure. They had transformed into a hollow labyrinth, each empty office a reminder of absence and betrayal. Robert's mornings were consumed by frantic phone calls and unanswered messages. He contacted colleagues, journalists, and even friends of Elena, but every inquiry ended in dead ends. No one had seen her leave, and the note she had left on his desk offered nothing beyond cryptic reassurance. Some truths are better found alone. Her words, once enticing, now felt like a razor against his psyche. He retraced his steps mentally, replaying every late-night meeting, every stolen glance, every whispered conversation in the courthouse hallway. Each memory was a puzzle piece, none of which made sense when laid out. Had she planned this all along? Had her disappearance been a calculated move to assert power over him, or had something darker occurred? The local police department was quick to respond. Detective Marcus Hayes, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for patience and persistence, took the case personally. He arrived at Robert's residence, his eyes sharp, demeanor calm but probing. "Judge Langley," Hayes began, his voice steady yet carrying an unspoken intensity. "We need to know everything about your relationship with Elena Marks. Nothing is too small." Robert hesitated, swallowed, and then recounted the affair from its inception, the late-night texts, the shared confessions, the clandestine meetings. Every detail, every emotion, he disclosed with a mix of shame and desperation. Detective Hayes listened carefully, scribbling notes, occasionally raising an eyebrow but never betraying judgment. Meanwhile, the media had begun to frame the story as a vanishing mystery rather than just a scandal. Headlines screamed, "Dallas judge's secret lover disappears amid courtroom scandal. Elena Marks missing. Affair turns into mystery." Social media speculation ran rampant, with anonymous users claiming sightings and offering theories, some plausible, some absurd. Robert scrolled through posts, each one cutting deep in the last. As days passed, Robert's routine deteriorated. He avoided the courthouse, fearing both judgment and discovery. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by images of Elena, sometimes confident, sometimes terrified, sometimes angry, and he began to question reality itself. Had she truly vanished by choice, or was there a danger he couldn't yet see? Detective Hayes had started a formal investigation, interviewing Elena's colleagues, friends, and even former partners. He discovered layers of her life Robert had never known, a network of contacts, secret financial transactions, and a past punctuated by small manipulations and calculated risks. The more Hayes uncovered, the more he realized that Elena was a master of control, someone capable of orchestrating her disappearance in ways that blurred the line between voluntary absence and coercion. Robert's guilt was relentless. Each day without Elena was a reminder of his complicity, of the bridge they had crossed into moral ambiguity. The thrill of their secret had been intoxicating, but the aftermath was a psychological maelstrom. He began to pace his study, revisiting every conversation, analyzing every text message, searching for a clue, a sign, anything that could illuminate her whereabouts. Late one night, he found himself standing by the window, staring out at the Dallas skyline, lights twinkling like distant stars. The city felt alive with secrets, each illuminated window a potential witness, each shadow a possible observer. He imagined Elena moving unseen among them, a phantom weaving through the chaos she had created. And yet, despite the fear, there was an undeniable pull, a mixture of hope, obsession, and dread that tethered him to her absence. She had vanished physically, but her influence remained. shaping his thoughts, his emotions, and the very air of his life. Every whisper of movement outside his house, every shadow in the hallways of the courthouse, reminded him that the hidden world they had shared was far from over. Detective Hayes concluded his first week of investigation with no definitive leads. Elena's vanishing seemed deliberate, precise, and eerily controlled. The courthouse scandal had escalated into a disappearance mystery, but beyond speculation, there was nothing tangible. No footprints, no messages, no signs of struggle. As Robert sat alone, the weight of solitude pressing against him, he realized the reality of their situation. The affair had ended, but the consequences had only begun. He was entangled in a web of desire, guilt, and uncertainty, and Elena's disappearance had elevated every risk into a tangible, inescapable tension. Night deepened over Dallas, thick and impenetrable. Somewhere beyond the city streets, Elena existed in some hidden world of her own making, leaving Robert confront a reality that was as empty and unsettling as the courthouse corridors he once dominated. The vanishing had occurred, but its meaning and its ultimate cost remained a mystery, poised to unfold in ways he could not yet predict. The investigation into Elena Marks' disappearance had evolved into a labyrinth of half-truths, conflicting accounts, and whispered secrets. Detective Marcus Hayes moved methodically, unraveling layers of her life that Robert Langley had never glimpsed. Every interview, every document, every casual remark revealed fragments of reality far more intricate and dangerous than anyone had imagined. It began with Elena's apartment. Hayes combed through papers, receipts, and digital traces, discovering patterns that suggested meticulous planning. Every transaction, every late-night purchase, hinted at someone who anticipated contingencies, someone who could vanish without a trace. Elena had constructed a world hidden beneath the ordinary routines of her life, a shadow existence only now coming into focus. Robert, still reeling from the initial shock, was brought in to provide further insight. Sitting across from Hayes, he recounted moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, a sudden change in Elena's tone, a fleeting look of calculation, an unexpected meeting she had arranged alone. Each memory, revisited in light of her disappearance, became a potential clue, and a mirror reflecting his own complicity. "You say she left a note," Hayes said, flipping through his notebook. "Did she ever hint at knowing something you didn't? Something dangerous?" Robert hesitated, recalling the cryptic nature of her text messages and whispered confessions. She often spoke in riddles, but I thought it was playful," he admitted. "I never imagined she could disappear like this." Hayes nodded slowly. "Playfulness can mask calculation. Sometimes the person closest to you can manipulate reality without detection." Robert felt a chill. It was not just fear of the law, but fear of the psychological labyrinth Elena had drawn him into. He realized he had been both participant and pawn, seduced into a game whose rules were dictated by someone whose motives remained opaque. The investigation soon uncovered further dimensions of her life. Former colleagues and acquaintances painted a picture of a woman who navigated professional and personal relationships with precision, often leveraging subtle influence to achieve her aims. Small manipulations, carefully orchestrated interactions, and strategic absences formed a pattern that now seemed deliberate, a map to her vanishing. Meanwhile, the media intensified their scrutiny. Headlines shifted from scandal to mystery. Elena Marks, a life of secrets and shadows, Judge Langley's vanished lover, the hidden world of Dallas court scandals. Social media users debated endlessly. Had she left willingly, or had something sinister occurred? Every public statement, every whispered speculation, pressed further into Robert's psyche. Robert found himself walking the fine line between obsession and investigation, retracing the courthouse hallways in his mind, replaying every interaction with Elena, questioning his own judgment and desires. Shadows of truth, the things he had ignored, dismissed, or rationalized, now pressed relentlessly against his conscience. Late one night, Hayes presented a lead, a small financial transaction previously overlooked tied to a relative of Elena's from out of state. It was minimal, almost innocuous, but in context it suggested premeditation. She had anticipated leaving Dallas, had prepared for contingencies, and had intentionally left no trail. The realization hit Robert like a physical blow. Elena had orchestrated the vanishing with precision, leaving him confront both the scandal and the psychological consequences alone. Robert sat alone in his study, the weight of isolation pressing down. The city outside continued its indifferent rhythm, lights flickering against glass towers like distant watchful eyes. He felt the shadows of truth pressing closer, revealing not just Elena's secrets, but the fragility of his own life, the extent to which he had allowed desire to compromise reason, the affair, the scandal, the disappearance. It was all a reflection of choices, manipulation, and the consequences of hidden worlds intersecting with reality. And though Elena remained physically absent, her presence, her influence, her calculated mastery, dominated every thought, every fear, every sleepless hour. The stage was set for the final unraveling, the truth of her disappearance, whether voluntary or sinister, would soon collide with the public and personal consequences that Robert could no longer ignore. And in the shadows of truth, the line between victim and participant, between love and manipulation, blurred irrevocably. The courthouse, once a sanctuary of order and law, now seemed alien to Robert Langley. Its marble corridors and polished with surfaces, previously symbols of authority and stability, now echoed with the ghosts of secrecy, temptation, and betrayal. Every step he took carried the weight of the scandal, the vanished lover, and the unraveling of his carefully controlled life. Days had turned into weeks since Elena Marks disappeared, yet her absence was a presence in every thought, every waking moment. The media frenzy had subsided slightly, replaced by speculation and retrospectives, but the emotional impact on Robert remained raw and relentless. He had been exposed publicly, humiliated privately, and left to wrestle with the consequences of choices he once thought inconsequential. Detective Marcus Hayes had concluded his investigation without a definitive conclusion. Elena had vanished deliberately, leaving behind a trail that ended where he could not follow. Robert was left with fragments, cryptic notes, brief messages, and the haunting memory of her voice whispering in dim hallways. The truth of her intentions remained shrouded, a shadow in the corners of his mind that refused to fade. In the solitude of his study, Robert reflected on the events that had led here. He had been drawn in by desire, captivated by a presence that combined charm, intellect, and subtle control. Elena had been both a mirror and a mystery, reflecting his own suppressed longing while manipulating reality around her. And in surrendering to that desire, he had sacrificed more than his professional reputation. He had surrendered peace of mind, certainty, and a sense of self. Yet, amid the wreckage, there were lessons carved deep into his psyche. The affair had revealed vulnerabilities he had long ignored, cracks in the armor of his life that he could no longer deny. Trust, he realized, was both fragile and combustible. Secrecy, intoxicating yet dangerous. Desire, a force capable of illuminating both ecstasy and devastation. Robert knew he could not rewind time or undo the past. The city of Dallas, indifferent and sprawling, moved on around him, as relentless as it had always been. Yet he could control what remained, his actions, his responses, and the life he would rebuild from the remnants of exposure and loss. He revisited Elena's cryptic messages, attempting to decipher any pattern, any intention, any hint of reconciliation. But each word, each punctuation mark, revealed more about her mastery than any clear plan. She had vanished, but in doing so, she had left a permanent mark, a psychological scar that would linger far longer than any media headline or court filing. Robert found a strange mixture of emotions: anger, guilt, longing, and a grudging admiration for her ability to orchestrate her own disappearance. He understood, perhaps too late, that the affair had been a transaction of power disguised as passion. Elena had given him desire, but at a cost that could not be repaid: control, certainty, and innocence of heart. In the evenings, he walked the city streets, observing the indifferent faces of strangers, the unbroken rhythm of life that continued despite personal catastrophes. He thought of Elena moving through these same streets, unseen, untraceable, a phantom who had redefined the rules of engagement. The city had witnessed her absence and his exposure, yet neither of them belonged to its scrutiny anymore. Time, he realized, was both a healer and a revealer. The scandal would fade, curiosity would wane, but the consequences of desire, the vulnerability, the temptation, the human cost, would remain. Robert's career would recover, His reputation mended in the court of public perception, yet the intimate lessons of betrayal and manipulation would endure, etched into memory and identity. The courthouse remained a symbol, but one transformed. Its quiet chambers, shadowed hallways, and polished surfaces no longer signified authority. They were reminders of human fragility, the price of hidden passions, and the peril inherent in surrendering to desire. Robert sat alone one night, the city lights painting patterns across his study walls. He allowed himself a moment of reflection, a deep inhale of acceptance. He would never forget Elena Marks, her absence, or the choices that had led them to this intersection of scandal, secrecy, and longing. The affair had been intoxicating, but the cost, emotional, psychological, and reputational, was irrefutable. Some truths, he realized, are learned too late. Desire can illuminate, enthrall, and empower, but it can also exact a price beyond anticipation. Robert had paid it, and in doing so, had glimpsed a precarious balance between love, manipulation, and the human impulse to surrender to temptation. The city outside carried on indifferent and unyielding, while inside, Robert Langley understood the gravity of the lesson. The price of desire is not always visible in the moment, but it is always, inevitably exacted. And sometimes those who vanish leave the deepest imprint, not on the world, but on the soul of the one left behind. The courthouse had returned to its outward appearance of order, the polished floors and echoing chambers once again humming with routine. Yet for Robert Langley, each step through familiar halls carried a memory of what had transpired, the affair, the exposure, and the vanishing of Elena Marks. Every corner seemed haunted by her presence, every silent room echoing the consequences of desire. The city's gossip had quieted, the media frenzy having moved on to the next scandal, but the whispers lingered in private circles. Colleagues were polite but reserved, eyes flicking just long enough to remind Robert that the past remained an invisible, unshakable companion. Even routine meetings felt charged, as if the walls themselves remembered the secrets once whispered in dimly lit corridors. Robert often walked alone through chambers where he had once felt invincible, reflecting on the fragile nature of trust and the weight of secrecy. The thrill of his clandestine connection with Elena had faded into something heavier, a mixture of regret, fascination, and lingering obsession. He understood now that desire carries consequences far beyond immediate pleasure, that even a fleeting connection can leave permanent marks on the psyche. Detective Marcus Hayes had closed the investigation, unable to locate Elena or determine the full extent of her motives. The case files sat in neatly stacked folders, evidence of a mystery unresolved. Robert sometimes reviewed them, not to find her, but to relive the tension, the psychological tug-of-war, and the intricate web she had spun around him. Occasionally, a faint whisper of memory would surface. The way she looked in the hallway, her cryptic messages, her calculated steps away from Dallas. He pictured her moving unseen through the city, a phantom orchestrating her own destiny, leaving him to reconcile with both his longing and his guilt. The courthouse, indifferent to personal histories, continued its relentless rhythm. Trials proceeded, decisions were rendered, and justice marched forward. Yet for Robert, the echoes of past choices lingered, a constant reminder that human desire, secrecy, and manipulation are forces capable of shaping lives in profound, irreversible ways. Even in solitude, he felt her presence in the smallest ways. A note left on his desk during a fleeting absence, a memory of a whispered confession, the shadow of a smile that had once enthralled him. Elena Marks had vanished physically, but her influence endured, a haunting testament to the power of hidden worlds and the cost of surrendering to temptation. As the sun set over Dallas, casting long shadows to the courthouse windows, Robert paused to consider the lessons learned. Desire is intoxicating, secrecy is perilous, and the consequences of human choices often ripple far beyond immediate perception. The scandal had passed, the city had moved on, but the personal echoes, the psychological tremors of intimacy, betrayal, and manipulation remained indelible. In the quiet of the chambers, Robert understood the truth that had been revealed too late. Some lessons are learned not through choice, but through consequence. And in that realization, he found both the weight of regret and the faint, lingering clarity that even amidst ruin, understanding can emerge in the shadows of desire. The courthouse stood silent once more, a monument to law and order. But for Robert Langley, it had become a cathedral of echoes, echoes of love, loss, and the inescapable price of human desire.